I am a male, and am now 30 years old. My family moved to the States when I turned 14, but I grew up in Russia, in a town called Kirov. It was big enough to house a full spread of criminal activity, from organized crime to cannibalistic hobos. These few stories are not tied together with anything else other than a cultural connection. Brief, absolutely true, and hopefully will give you a small glimpse of the state the country was in the 90s right after the collapse. When I was very little, we lived in a typical Russian 5-story apartment building, in a what would be considered middle-class neighborhood. It was fairly quiet, with nothing much happening, so us kids could play outside for as long as we wanted without adult supervision. I remember a man living on the first floor of our building, his kitchen window overlooking the staircase which ran out onto the sidewalk. He was probably in his mid to late 30s, always wearing a dirty wife beater, never a clean shave. Every time it seemed, as I would walk or ride my bike by his window, he would be sitting there, sometimes a glass of milk in hand. He would then jump up from his chair and begin to yell and shout as loud as he could at me, swearing, calling me names, threatening. All of this he would do with excessive violent movement and facial expressions. As a 4-year-old kid, I would just stand there in horror, watching him do his crazy, murderous acting. He would fall on his elbows on the windowsill and shake his head, feverishly spitting out curses and deathly threats at me, his eyes bulging. He would punch his chest with all his strength, and almost in tears of some deep rage, would announce his hatred towards me, and how much he wished me dead. And if that wasn't enough, he would then pretend to be going for the door as if finally having found the resolution to go through with it, then coming back to the window, and more shouting, more threats. I just remember never being able to stand or stay there for the horror that overtook me, and I would always run in the end, leaving the crazy man just staring at me out of his window. One day he was gone, disappeared. No more insane man in the window. Being a kid, I just moved on with my life, and didn't think about the matter for years. Until much later I told my parents about him and what he did for the first time. The story they told me confirmed my suspicions of his true nature. Around the same time as one of the last that I've seen him, a strange occurrence happened in our city. Body parts were found scattered throughout it, all far from each other, and all belonging to one unfortunate man, whose wife plotted to kill him for the sake of acquiring his apartment and belongings. Her brother happened to be the freak living downstairs, who both violently killed the husband, dismembering his body in a tub, and distributed the pieces, including the head, all throughout town. Everything led to the wife, and it didn't take her long to blame the entire adventure on her dear brother, who, to this day, is sleeping in some dark cell far away in the cold. When I was in the 8th grade, my school started to have roof problems. It was an old building which used to belong to some merchant who lived back in the days of the Tsars, and every year it seemed to give more and more, until it finally gave a class full of students, the ceiling falling on their heads. For the time it would take to restore the building, the student body would attend classes in public school number 22. I still remember it clearly, a fortress of bad behavior bordering homicide. The students of number 22 mostly came from awful circumstances and enjoyed humiliation, severe beatings, just any kind of abuse. At that time, street fighting was also very common in the country, and the fights rarely ended with just a black eye or a busted lip. Broken bones, skull fractures, coma and death were routine. One day, as my friends and I were talking in a hallway between classes, a big, bald kid came up to us, with his entourage of hopeless degenerates. He told us how they had had enough of us, and were planning to beat the life out of any boy from our school once classes were over. They didn't like us from the start because our school was considered preppy, and they acted as if we were intruding on their territory. He told us they were all going to be there, and it was gearing up to be a great show. We knew immediately he meant what he said, as this guy had a certain authority in that dark place, and most kids were afraid of him. He was one of those people who learned to swing at anyone who did anything so much as annoy him. And he wasn't alone. There were many. We told our teachers what he said, and they let us go secretly 20 minutes before the last class was over. My friends and I all banded together as we got dressed for the winter day outside, and left the school. The plan was to stick together and walk to the bus stop. I got on my bus and stood by the window. The route led right by the school, and I would be able to see the main entrance and what could be happening there. As we were driving by, what I saw became etched in my mind for the rest of my life. On the white snow in the clearing before the large doors of number 22 was an assembly of 200 to 250, mostly male figures, dressed in black colours and forming a giant circle. In the middle of the circle I could see a fight underway. Just two of them, one with his arms thrown open as if taunting his opponent, and the other, someone who did not look like they wanted to be there. This turned out to be a big operation on their part, as it looked like more were invited to what was being planned. I later learned that once they found out we left early, as the final bell rang all of my classmates and I were already gone, they decided to beat on their own, and some poor kid was picked and beat so hard he ended up in an ICU. Since my school was very small in numbers, and some parents altogether decided to homeschool their kids for the time of the repairs, we would easily have been outnumbered 10 to 1. I hate to think what would have happened if our teachers did not let us out early that day. On the next day, armed security was on the school premises, and they stayed there until we were able to attend our old but now dearly loved home of a dead merchant. Going back to a time when I was a kid, this last story is my personal claim to victory in the game of life or death, which happens to fall in our hands from time to time, for no apparent reason at all. I was maybe 9 at the time. We moved to a better area, more space, better location. Our apartment was on the last, 6th floor, and the last one on the landing. It was the furthest you could go from the entrance of the building and fairly secluded. The staircase was also completely indoors, essentially housing anyone who entered in a climb, floor after floor, with 4 apartments to a landing. This day I came home from school around 2 p.m. My parents weren't due back home for at least 3 hours, and I set about doing my usual homework, watching TV, and emptying the fridge. It was around the time I settled in for an episode of Babylon 5, a plate with a bit of everything on my lap, that I heard the front doorbell ring. This was very odd, as my parents both had their key, and no one else usually visited around this time of day. I went over to the front door and asked, "Who is it?" I heard a man answer back, "Hi there. I'm from the electrical company. We are doing a routine check of the electric meters. May I come in and inspect yours? It will only take a minute." I looked through the peephole and saw a young man, probably nearing 30, very clean, neatly dressed, with his hair combed to the side. He even held a clipboard in his hand with some papers attached. I was about to twist open the lock when I saw something, because of the fisheye view I had on the landing. I could also see a little extra to the sides. On my left, the man's right, I saw light bouncing from what looked like a sharp metal object. Then for a second, I clearly saw what it was, the cutting edge of an axe. Someone was standing to the right of the door, attempting to hide from view, holding an axe. At this point my memory gets blurry. I remember getting away from the door and creeping into the room, which was the farthest in the hallway, closing the door and not coming out until my parents got back. The bell kept ringing for a few more minutes, and then it finally fell silent. I never told anyone about it. Until now, I guess. These are my stories, and thank you to all who shared your own. I think it is important to learn of these encounters. Hi folks, Hellfreezer here. Now I'm sure something at the beginning there caught everyone's attention just as it did mine. I know it certainly did over in Let's Not Meet, and that would be the cannibalistic hobos. Well, turns out Raymond Cloud, that's the gentleman who was very kind to share his story with us, did add a little bit extra to that in the comments section. And it went like this. Thank you. And to answer your question, It was a one-time occurrence as far as I can remember. Apparently 2 men and a woman, all homeless, stalked a lady in the middle of the day. They killed her, and managed to cut off a few limbs to take with them. Somebody spotted them sitting around a fire in a park, with some blood splattered around. They had a pot full of water propped up above the fire and something floating in it. The cops showed up and saw that it was a human foot, and that's when they discovered the body nearby. It gets really cold in winter, and to be homeless in that environment, well, you can imagine. Let me start out by saying, I'm a 5-foot fuck-all female. I have a baby face that gives the illusion of sweet innocence. Mostly, forever looking like a preteen is advantageous. Sometimes, though, it makes me look like an easy target. This is the first of many encounters I've unfortunately had, and the one that sticks out the most. I was 17, mid-20s now. I worked at a local grocery store in a small, mundane town. Being a high school student, I worked evenings and got out around 10:30 p.m. I walked home alone every single night, and I had worked there since I was 15. It was my area, where I grew up, so I never had any fear. Thankfully, though, I was still alert. Anyways, on this night I was about halfway home, passing my local 24-hour convenience store. I always became more alert after this point because, until then, I was walking on well-lit main roads, and I could probably motivate my stubby little legs to sprint to the store if anything happened. After that, it's small residential roads with many a dark place to hide, for myself or murderers. I walked past the store and noticed a few cars parked outside. Nothing out of the ordinary. I cross the street and descend into the dark residential area. It's worth noting that not many cars really drive down those streets, especially this late at night. As I'm walking, I see 2 really bright lights roll up behind me, obviously a car, and honestly not super strange at this point. I keep walking, but I turn my head to try and see what the car looked like, or who might be inside. I can't see shit because this car's lights are super bright. I speed up a little, but this car keeps slowly following behind, creeping closer and closer. I am full-on shitting myself at this point, but I don't quite break into a run because it's still a ways to my house, and the car could easily catch up to me. This may seem stupid, but I watched a lot of animal nature shows, and the one thing they always say is a trademark of prey is running. I guess I thought if I walked confidently enough, it would scare them off. At any rate, there was a corner coming up onto a very small road that leads to the street I live on. So I decided not to go into full-blown panic mode unless this car follows me down this street. I quicken my pace, turn the corner, and look back. The lights are finally out of my eyes, and I can sort of see the car. It has stopped where I had turned. I absolutely shit myself because I remember seeing that car parked at the convenience store, and to my absolute horror, the car slowly starts to turn the corner. I freak out and scramble to find my phone, but I fucking forgot it at work like a moron. So I pull out my iPod Touch and pretend it's a phone to at least make it seem like I'm talking to someone. I turn around, iPod to ear, and look this car dead in the windshield, light still blinding, and throw it the dirtiest look ever while breaking into a slight jog. I hear the window go down and this motherfucker starts cooing at me. Like some really lifelike dove noises, and I just fucking book it. I hear the car speed up behind me, and as soon as I round the corner to get onto my street, I dive into one of my neighbour's bushes because I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to my house before the car caught up. I sat and waited. The car came slowly around the corner and stops just ahead of the place I was hiding, and continues cooing. Like, fuck this guy. I was so prepared to sit there for the whole night because I was pretty convinced he didn't know I was there. A couple of tense moments roll by and the car just suddenly takes off. Never have I been so relieved. It was dark, so I didn't catch its plate numbers, and the worst part about it was, I saw the car switch off its high beams. All I could think was they must have been turned on to purposefully blind me. I stay hidden for a bit, because I'm afraid the car is lurking somewhere. Adrenaline eventually took over though, and I just started sprinting home. I got in the house and just started bawling my eyes out. I was absolutely inconsolable, hyperventilating, full body shakes, dry heaving, the whole 9 yards. I had never been so afraid for my life, and it wasn't until I got home that I fully started to register that fear. It was just my poor 15-year-old brother who was home, and he had no idea what to do. After I calmed down, I called the police, but nothing happened. I didn't have a very good description of the car besides its colour and make, and never saw who was driving. The most horrifying part about this story isn't what happened to me though. The reason this story sticks out in my head is because, not a month later, a young girl who was very drunk was snatched from the side of the road about 10 blocks where I had been walking. The guy took her and raped her for 3 days in his basement, but she managed to escape. The house she was being kept in was abandoned, and the guy was never caught. There is no way to know for sure it was related, but I shudder to think what might have happened had I not dove into that bush and been super alert to what was going on that night. So, very long story short, creeping cooing fuck in the blue car? Let's never meet again. A few months ago, my friend Jordan and I decided to camp outside this box office to get tickets to a concert. Her friend Steven decided to tag along, which made me slightly more comfortable, because the box office was kind of isolated, and we had to walk about a mile in the middle of the night to get there, because the parking in my city is atrocious. Safety in numbers and all that. So, we get there at around 3 a.m, and the place is packed. I should probably mention here that I bought my ticket months in advance, and I was just tagging along so Jordan didn't have to wait alone. She really wanted to see this band. There were tons of people, 500 or so, crammed into a very small area, and everyone was smoking weed and being loud. I didn't know Stephen was going to be there until that night. Otherwise, I probably would have not subjected myself to this event. After about an hour or so, this lost all novelty to me, and I decided to leave with the excuse of bringing them food, since I didn't need a ticket, and was tired of being there. So I started the trek back to where we'd been able to park my car. Between the box office and the church we finally decided to park at, there's this super long walking trail, which in the daylight is probably a good place to walk. So I'm about halfway through it, when I suddenly hear really loud footsteps behind me. I look behind me and I find this guy sprinting toward me, and I'm terrified. I'm not much of a runner, and I'm pretty much terrified with fear, so naturally, I stop and wait for death to take me, because fight or flight is not a response my mind has even been wired to enact. As I'm standing there, the guy sprints right past me. I watch him run away, give my heart a few moments to start functioning again, and realize I was overreacting. I see a lot of night joggers in my city, it's not a big deal. Even so, I complete the rest of the walk through the trail a bit more skeptically. I really wish that had been the end of it. So once you get past the trail, you still have to walk up this service road that runs parallel to the highway to get to the church. The church I parked at is at the top of this hill. I get to the top of the hill, proud of myself for not passing out because honestly, it was really steep. Then I see him. The same guy who ran past me earlier, and he's just standing at the top of the hill, looking at me. Now at this point I'm beyond horrified, because I tend to be a nervous, twitchy girl to begin with, and seeing this guy who terrified me completely motionless, with his gaze trained on me, is not conducive to rational thinking. Turning wouldn't have done me any good because I would have had to go a mile before I got to anyone who could help me. But I also had to get past him to get to my car. Realizing I didn't have a viable course of action, I did the only thing I could. I kept walking, sincerely hoping he wasn't a murderer. Once I passed him, I looked over my shoulder a couple of times, and each time he was in the exact same spot, watching me walk away. I was insanely creeped out, but the more distance I put between us, the better I felt. Eventually, I got to where I couldn't see him, and I was reasonably sure he wasn't interested in killing me. He was probably just some guy hanging out in the early hours of the morning, terrifying young girls who were all alone. Maybe a hobby of his. I made it to my car and, of course, immediately locked the doors, and headed out to the 24-hour restaurant Jordan and Stephen requested. Smooth sailing, right? Except, as I was pulling out of the parking lot, the same freaky guy had moved substantially closer to where I had parked, and was still watching me. When he started walking toward my car, I noped out of there as quickly as I possibly could. Probably not at the posted speed limit. Luckily, when I brought back their food, I just dropped it off and immediately drove back to my dorm to go to sleep, because I earned it. So yeah, night jogger, potential murderer. Let's not meet. Too long, didn't read. Encountered the same stranger 3 times in like an hour, on a long 4 AM walk, and was reasonably spooked by him. We will not be walking anywhere at night ever again. Hey guys, Hellfreezer again. Thanks very much for listening. As always, like, comment, and if you haven't done already, subscribe. Until next time. Take care, guys.